Good afternoon, everybody. I'm back again to finish up Learning Unit 3 today, as promised. I will be looking at the last part of the story we started last week called The Bloody Chamber, the title story of Angela Carter's collection by the same name. I'm going to try to keep it nice and short today, as best as I can, although I'm often not good at that. But I am in the thick of marking your Part 1 essays, assignments, and just to give you some insight into my approach and what you can expect to see when you get your work back. Basically, you're going to get 2 marks, one for each question out of 50, and you will see what my aim is to give you quite a lot of feedback for the question specifically that you will need to resubmit for your POE towards the end of the year. So the lower marked one you get back will be the one you need to resubmit and improve according to the feedback that I've given you. So on your script, you'll see a mark out of 100 and then 2 other marks out of 50 to give you that score out of 100, of course. Pay attention to the feedback I give you on both, of course, but especially on the one that I've given you to resubmit. So I am on my side using a rubric to work out standards and remind myself of the expectations. That rubric, though, is not exactly a memo. So it's not telling me exactly what I should look for. As such, I'm not going to include the rubric scores on your work. What I'm giving you is what I'm doing is kind of internalizing the standard of the rubric and working out in my head a fairly subjective, because it is English after all, a fairly subjective score of where I think you are in your development and giving you some tips and advice to get better down the line as you head potentially into your second year of English studies where the work gets progressively more difficult. So that's what you can expect to see when you get your work back, hopefully sometime next week. So let's get straight into the next story. We were about halfway through, and we got to the page to the part where the young unnamed heroine in Angela Carter's story is about to open the door into her brand new husband's secret room that he's forbidden her to look in. While he's gone away on business, she's decided to disobey him, take a key, open the door, and see what is inside a room he described as being his own personal hell. And what we see inside that room is truly a literally an actual bloody chamber. It's like a little chamber of horrors. If you're familiar with perhaps the 50 Shades of Grey books and movies, this is it's just cranked up to 11. You'll see that the first line of the paragraph where this part of the story begins starts with the line, there is a striking resemblance between the act of love and the ministrations of a torturer. That's actually a quote from a poem written by a famous French writer from a few hundred years ago, who was also a Marquis, actually. His name was Marquis de Sade. Like D-E, S-A-D-E, Marquis de Sade. And he wrote kind of this very out there stuff about what we today actually call after him, which is sadism. He wrote stories of like sadism and sexual exploitation and sexual sadism. Basically, kind of one of the early guys to make the argument that it's possible to feel pleasure through pain. Okay, and that is one of the themes that Carter is working with here. Is it possible to feel good through physical pain? Does agony lead to some kind of a higher level of enjoyment or something like that? So to say there's a striking resemblance between the act of love and the ministrations of a torturer is certainly an interesting way to start the section of the story. Ministrations means like the way that somebody attends to you, the way that, in this case, how a torturer attends to the body. And when you think about it, it is kind of an interesting combination of things to put together. she's saying that the act of love and the act of torture are the same thing, basically. That in order to bring another person physical pleasure requires, in a way, the same knowledge or set of skills as to bring them physical pain, actually. You've got to know how the body works. You have to know uh, what parts of the body are sensitive, what parts of the body are vulnerable. You have to know what would feel good, and you have to know what will feel, by the same token, you have to know what would feel bad, right? So a torturer and a lover in the story are the same thing. And that is exactly what her husband turns out to be. Let me get to the PDF here quickly. I'm going to share it on my screen. This is where we got to last time. She walks into the door. She walks into the room. I turn the key and the door creaks slowly back. And there we start. There is a striking resemblance. And she walks inside, and one of the first things she sees is a metal figure hinged at the side, which I knew to be spiked on the inside and to have the name the Iron Maiden. If you were paying attention to my slide there, you would have seen a picture of an Iron Maiden on the left or right hand side of the screen. It's basically like a huge upright coffin, and it's got these spikes on the inside. So you would put somebody in the coffin, still alive, not dead, and you'd slowly close the door on them, and the spikes would, with agonizing pain and agonizing slowness, creep into your body, and you would basically just simultaneously be stabbed and bleed to death at the same time. So a very kind of torturous, gruesome thing, and that's what she finds throughout this room, is all these tools of torture around the room. The Iron Maiden. There's a wheel, a Catherine wheel. I'll show you what those looks like now. There's a catafalque or catafalque, and how she describes it here in the bottom of page 26 is that the walls of this dark torture chamber were naked rock. They gleamed as if they were sweating with fright. At the four corners of the room were funerary urns of great antiquity, Etruscan perhaps, and on three-legged ebony stands the bowls of incense he had left burning, which filled the rooms with a sacerdotal reek. Wheel, rack, and Iron Maiden were, I saw, displayed as grandly as if they were items of statuary, and I was almost consoled then, and almost persuaded myself that I might have stumbled only upon a little museum of his perversity, that he had installed through these monstrous items here only for contemplation. Yet, at the center of the room lay a catafalque, a doomed, ominous bier of Renaissance workmanship, surrounded by long white candles, and at its foot an armful of the same lilies with which he had filled my bedroom, stowed in a 4-foot high jar glazed with a somber Chinese red. I scarcely dared examine this catafalque and its occupant more closely, yet I knew I must. That is where the opera singer lay, quite naked, under a thin sheet of very rare and precious linen. Then it says, as she looks at the body of one of his former wives, she says, the worst thing was the dead lips smiled. She walks into this room. It's a torture chamber. She sees these things, wheel, rack, and Iron Maiden, adorning the place, and realizes that her husband has been using these instruments to systematically murder all of his previous wives. And this is where he keeps the body, in a kind of perverse little mausoleum or museum, where he's able to do goodness knows what to their remains. So she stumbled into this absolutely horrible place. Here she describes the Iron Maiden, where one of the other wives has been kept. And as she opens the door and the 100 spikes come out of the body, the blood seeps out onto the floor. And she gets such a shock that she drops the key in the blood, picks it up again because she has to get out of there and lock the door again. But that is also an element from the original fairy tale that Carter's kept. She's going to have this blood remain as a permanent stain on the key, so that it becomes a telltale sign to her husband that his wife has disobeyed her and knows what his secret is, right? And I guess there's plenty you can say thematically about what it is that why she puts this in the story in the way that she does. But I think it's important to get us kind of get your head around this idea of like sadism, that for Angela Carter, love is something that isn't necessarily innocent. It's not like a childlike thing that you should approach naively. Love is quite serious, and it has different sides to it. It has a good side, a wholesome side, but then it also has a dark underbelly. And as I said to, I'm just going to come back to my slides here quickly. As I've said to a couple of other classes over the years I've taught this, if you're struggling to kind of wrap your head around why this belongs in the short story at all, perhaps think of yourself. We all, no matter how civilized and pleasant we are, no matter how good we are and religious or not religious, moral or not, we all have the capacity for bloodlust. Bloodlust being this feeling of like you enjoy the spectacle of violence. We don't necessarily have to enjoy enacting violence or being violent, but we do get a kick out of seeing it on the screen, and even seeing it around us in real life. And often struck by this exact thing whenever I watch sport, especially say rugby. I think we all kind of like rugby or know what goes on in rugby. But rugby indulges a certain bloodlust in the audience who watch it. We like to see the big hit. And even though those guys are massive, strong, beefy men, they go so hard in this game that they frequently get themselves knocked out, or they limp off the field in agony with broken bones or sprained joints or concussions. These guys are some of the fittest athletes in the world, but they go so hard that even they're not able to keep up with the demands placed on their body. And we love it. We love to watch the hit, the big tackle. We like to see the guy get up from underneath a ruck or something and his face is bleeding, his nose is smashed. We like to watch UFC, the ultimate cage fighting stuff, with Dricus du Plessis and putting people in strangleholds and whatnot. That's a very good way to understand how we kind of enjoy and take a sick pleasure in it as well. We get pleasure from the spectacle of pain. We like it. We're not experiencing it. We're not doing it ourselves like the character is in the story here, but we kind of get up close to that dark side. And it wasn't that long ago, relative to human history, that we human beings, regularly actually used to go and watch full-on torture sessions. I mean, just 200, 300, 400 years ago, the way criminals were punished was by professional torturers who used these horrible instruments, racks and iron maidens and all sorts of other tools to punish criminals. And they were not done behind closed doors. They were done out in the open, in public. It was a spectacle. It was an event that people came to watch and actually enjoyed. So we now live in kind of way more civilized times where everyone has dignity, human rights, freedom of speech, and equal protection under the law. A few hundred years ago, our ancestors had no such conception of life working like that. If you were bad, you got punished, and the public had to see justice being done, and they enjoyed it. We are not so far removed from that, and I think there's still a residue of our own, like a human need to see a spectacle of violence, and we have other ways of achieving that now. Sports being probably one of the most obvious, I guess. But that's an Iron Maiden. This is a picture of a Catherine wheel. And what they would do with the wheel is the torture would actually basically take a criminal, a thief, a murderer, whatever, tie them up like this in these bonds. So they were held down, spread eagled. And then they would systematically drop this wheel, a literal big heavy wooden wheel, on their bones, on their ankles, on their knees, and all their joints, and slowly break all of their limbs. So that's where the saying to get broken on the wheel comes from. Once they were done with that, you were obviously still alive, but your limbs were all sort of flippy floppy. So they would just tie you up, as you see these dudes here in the background, where they tied up their limbs around the spokes of the wheel. Again, you were still alive at this point, and the way they finished you off was often after having tied you up on the wheel, they would set you on fire and burn you to death. And people would come and watch this in huge crowds, and massive audiences would come and watch it. Again, not that long ago, relative to us. And that kind of human need to see pain and bloodshed is also linked somewhat to enjoyment. And that's the thing, that's the material Carter is playing around with. It's all the ultimate latent material. It's a kind of barbaric, uncivilized savagery we've buried away deep inside of us as civilized people. And she's just trying to find a way to tap into it. It's there. It's in all of us, she's saying. It's not an alien, strange thing. It's possible for that stuff to come out again. And a lot of her stories are like that, bringing out this darker side of humanity, bringing up the dark side of masculinity, like the wolf, the man transforming into a dangerous predatory creature. It's always possible. So she says, metaphorically anyway. Whereas for the woman, the woman is in a way empowered by this dark energy, right? So she takes these fairy tales and empowers the woman with the dark latency that emerges in the story to rescue them. And in the original fairy tale of Bluebeard, the heroine's heroine's brothers come and save her, knights in shining armor. In this story, however, it's that her mother comes to save her. Okay. And as I said to you last time, throughout the story, the heroine, except for one act of disobedience, she's largely quite passive and just goes along with what the Marquis wants from her. Okay. And that is her sin. That's her mistake. That's her fault, according to Carter, is that she's too passive. She doesn't fight back. She has to rely on somebody else to save her. In this case, it's her mother. So the gender expectations there have switched around, right? Typically in fairy tales, the imperiled damsels have to be saved by the men. Here in the Bloody Chamber, it goes the other way. So if you go all the way towards the end of the story, which I'll get us back to now quickly, just so that we can see how Carter ends it. Oops, wrong button. Basically, the Marquis discovers his wife's transgression and becomes her executioner and says, off with your head. I'm going to cut your head off in a kind of religious ceremony. And she, again, because she's passive, she kind of just goes along with it. And she puts on the dress he tells her to. She puts on the choke of red rubies around her neck in pretty much the spot that he's going to chop her head off. And if you cycle all the way down to page 40 here, you'll get a description of that. Just wanted to see exactly where that was. Yeah, so basically he's sentenced her to death, and he's about to chop her head off. So there's like a nice kind of cinematic tension in the story, because we know the mother, we know somebody's going to come save the heroine, but who's it going to be, right? So the whiz of that heavy sword goes up, and the Marquis is holding the sword above his head, and he's about to bring it down on his wife's neck, when suddenly, out of nowhere, somebody comes. The Marquis stood transfixed, utterly dazed, at a loss. The puppet master, open-mouthed, wide-eyed, impotent at the last, saw his dolls break free of their strings, abandon the rituals he had ordained for them since time began, and start to live for themselves. The king, aghast, witnesses the revolt of his pawns. So for the Marquis, throughout his life, women have been his puppets, his playthings. And what is a puppet? It's something that you're in control of. It's got strings attached You can manipulate it as you please. You have ultimate power over that thing. Now the woman puppets they're breaking free of these strings, of their constraints. They're abandoning the system that the marquis, the patriarchy, I guess, has set for them, and they are no longer reading from his script, following his rules, right? So here at the last, the whole system has been inverted. Despite the passivity of the heroine, it turns out that the female nature is going to gain the upper hand on the masculine one. And it's going to come through the figure of her mother. You never saw such a wild thing as my mother, who had seized by the winds and blown out to sea so that her hair was her white mane. So now she's got a white mane. Right, remember the Marquis? He's the one who was described as being a predator. Now at the end, the mother is. Her black lisle legs exposed to the thigh, her skirts tucked around her waist, one hand on the reins of the rearing horse, while the other clasped my father's service revolver, and behind her the breakers of the savage, indifferent sea, like the witnesses of a furious injustice. And my husband stood stock still, as if she had been Medusa, the sword still raised over his head, as in those clockwork tableaux of Bluebeard that you see in glass cases at fairs. So the actual story this is based on emerges at the end. It was then as though a curious child pushed his centime into the slot and set all in motion. The heavy bearded figure roared out loud, braying with fury, and, wielding the honourable sword as if it were a matter of death or glory, charged us, all three. On her 18th birthday, my mother had disposed of a man-eating tiger that had ravaged the villages in the hills north of Hanoi. Now, without a moment's hesitation, she raised my father's gun, took aim, and put a single irreproachable bullet through my husband's head. So just like that, the mother, who was doing great things already when she was 18, so a year older than our heroine narrator, has now come back to save her daughter's life by putting a single irreproachable bullet right through my husband's head. See, she takes like dead aim, just one super accurate, skillful shot sorts him out. And that is what saves the heroine, is not the brothers, not a man. There is actually a man in the story that she's in love with, this guy Jean-Yves, who's he's a piano tuner who works at the castle, but he's blind. He can't see anything. And so he's the man she's actually kind of interested in and more suited, but he's kind of a useless man. He's not physical. He can't defeat the Marquis because he's not able to see. He's held back by something. Okay. So the male energy in the story is kind of useless and slack. It's not going to do anything. It requires a strong woman at the end to come in and sort things out. We then get a bit of a happily ever after kind of ending to the story, where the heroine describes how her life has gone after these events. And she's I think she's married Jean-Yves, or she set up house with him. The way she describes it here is kind of curious. She says at the end of page 41, here I was, scarcely a penny the richer, widowed at 17 in the most dubious circumstances, and busily engaged in setting up house with a piano tuner. Right? So she hasn't really, what they did with the money is kind of give it away to charity and have enough just for themselves to live off. But she's not rich. She's not married to the Marquis anymore. And she's not married to Jean-Yves either, to the piano tuner. She's setting up house with him. So it's kind of like the happily ever after is a compromised and a strange one, because it isn't happily ever after. It's kind of a long way short of that. It's something imperfect. And also it goes against the norms or social norms of what we expect, that man and a woman shouldn't set up house together. They should be married and have children. This is an inversion of that. And then the last paragraph here, no paint or powder. No paint nor powder, no matter how thick or white. Okay, I should have explained. I left something out, which is that just before the Marquis was going to chop the heroine's head off, he took the key with blood that has got blood on it, and he pressed it against the heroine's forehead. So it left a red mark of blood on her forehead. Okay, kind of it's almost like a religious symbol. I'm sort of made to think of maybe what we do over Ash Wednesday, where you put some ash on your forehead between your eyes. Also think in some Indian cultures and religions, they put a red mark or a red circle, a red dot on the forehead between the eyes. It's like a religious symbol, meaning you are an adherent of a certain faith and you're signaling it to the world. He did this where you put the blood stain on her forehead, and it stains her forehead. She can, as she says, yeah, she can never get the stain off. She can never rub it off. Nothing ever takes it off. She can't hide it either. No makeup is strong enough to cover it over. No paint nor powder, no matter how thick or white, can mask that red mark on my forehead. I'm glad he cannot see it, because her husband is blind. Not for fear of his revulsion, since I know he sees me clearly with his heart, but because it spares my shame. So she's glad her husband can't see the bloody red stain on her forehead that her ex-husband gave her, because it spares her shame. She is ashamed of this mark, and she's glad her husband cannot register the shame she feels about it. It's kind of a strange way to end the story, almost a downer note. We're supposed to be going towards happily ever after, a kind of pleasing happy ending. She's been saved. She's living with her mother again. She's found a man to be with, Jean-Yves, but she lives a life feeling shame or guilt or embarrassment at how it was that she ended up in these circumstances at all. So that's a very kind of strange but telling way, I think, to end the story. Because a lot of Carter's other stories ended on a note of the female character feeling good, feeling empowered, emboldened, feeling as though they've achieved, they've won, they've defeated the patriarchy, defeated the bad man. In this story, that isn't actually the case. The female is felt to have lost something, to have lost dignity. And you've got to remember what I said to you in the last class, which is that this story is a cautionary tale. It's a warning, one of those fairy tales that is a warning, right? I think the cautionary aspect here that is maintained from the original is here the heroine actually blames herself for what happened to her and for ever having been somebody else's victim, right? She's happy her husband can't see the mark of ignominy on her forehead, which could be a reference to the Scarlet Letter, which is a famous other story. The lesson is that women should look after themselves, right? They should be strong enough to look after themselves, and they should not be passive. They should not just go along with things. So the cautionary warning theme of the story is maintained in that way, that the heroine of the story isn't really a heroine at all. She's actually let herself be a victim. And that is something when we do that, when we fall into that trap of being victims in our own lives, we actually disempower ourselves so badly that other people have to step in and live our lives for us, have to do things for us. And that doesn't bring you a sense of dignity, individuality or freedom. And I think that is what Carter is most interested in, is how people achieve freedom, just total freedom to live their lives as they want to, say the things they want to, and do the things they want to. Well, the one way you don't achieve it is by sitting back, being passive, being slack, and not taking command of the life, the only life you've got. I found this quote from Helen Simpson, 2006, and where she said that one thing that is apparent throughout the Bloody Chamber as a whole collection of stories is that passivity is never a virtue. In fact, even especially not in women. Another passage might have been written specifically as an epigraph for the Bloody Chamber. To be the object of desire is to be defined in the passive case. To exist in the passive case is to die in the passive case. That is, to be killed. This is the moral of the fairy tale about the perfect woman. Okay, so to be the perfect woman, Carter is saying, is to be passive in the eyes of a man. So she's kind of advocating for women not to be stereotypically perfect, but rather to be strong, to be aggressive, to be decisive, and to take command of their lives. And you'll find that you'll find that theme being worked on as a variation throughout all the stories that are prescribed, throughout the whole collection, in fact. That Carter's working with this question: how do you take control of your life? And I think in the easiest way to read that is as a kind of a feminist message, but I think even if you're a man, you can read this and apply the same question to your own life. It isn't just only a question of gender. There's more to it than that. And I think the stories are interesting enough to accommodate many other interpretations besides the one I've just given you. So I'll end it there, and that is also going to be the end of learning unit. Is this learning unit 2? Yes, this is the end of learning unit 2. Sorry, I think I said 3 at the beginning. So we'll be moving on to learning unit 3 next time. And in our next live class, we will do a poem. We'll look at a poem by William Blake. It's called London. It's a pretty short poem, easy to read. You can find many people reading it online on YouTube if you want to. And that's the poem we'll start to look at. I'll send out a reminder ahead of time next week to read London by William Blake. Okay, I look forward to talking to you guys then. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a good week ahead. Cheers, guys.